Welcome back to the Quiet Lab, where we explore the beautiful complexity of biology at a pace that lets you actually absorb and appreciate what you're learning. If this is your first time here, I'd love for you to subscribe and join our community of curious minds who appreciate learning without the rush. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey to discover some of the most overlooked yet essential organisms on our planet. Now, close your eyes for just a moment and imagine you're walking through an ancient forest. Not the towering oak and pine forests of today, but something far older. Something from a time when the earth was still figuring out what it meant to be green. The air is thick and humid, almost tropical, and beneath your feet there's no crunch of leaves, no snap of twigs, just a soft cushioned silence. What you're stepping on in this ancient world are some of the very first pioneers of life on land, the quiet heroes who spent millions of years transforming bare rock into the foundations of every forest, every garden, every green space you've ever loved. Tonight, we're going to slow down and learn more about them. The mosses and ferns. Let's settle in and discover why these seemingly simple plants are actually some of the most sophisticated and successful organisms on our planet. Before we dive into the intimate details of moss and fern biology, let's place them in the grand story of life on Earth. In the vast family tree of living things, we find ourselves in the domain Eukarya, organisms whose cells have nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. Within this domain, we have the plant kingdom, and it's here that our story really begins. Plants evolved from green algae around 500 million years ago, but the transition from aquatic to terrestrial life wasn't a sudden leap. It was a gradual process of adaptation, innovation, and remarkable biological creativity. The earliest land plants faced challenges that no organism had ever encountered before. Think about what life in water provides. Every cell can directly absorb water and nutrients from its surroundings. The water itself provides structural support. An algae doesn't need a rigid skeleton because it's suspended in the water it lives in. And when it comes time to reproduce, gametes can simply swim through the water to find each other. But on land, everything changes. The air provides no structural support, no direct source of nutrients, and certainly no medium for swimming gametes. The first land plants had to solve all of these problems, and their solutions would set the stage for every terrestrial ecosystem that followed. Mosses represent one of the earliest and most elegant solutions to terrestrial life. Rather than trying to completely overcome the limitations of land, they found ways to work with them. They stayed small, keeping their cells close to sources of moisture. They developed specialized structures for absorbing water directly through their surfaces. And perhaps most importantly, they maintained their dependence on water for reproduction, creating a life cycle that bridges the aquatic past and terrestrial future. But these early pioneers didn't just adapt to life on land, they actively transformed it. As moss colonies grew and died generation after generation, they began the slow process of breaking down solid rock into the first primitive soils. They were the original ecosystem engineers, creating the conditions that would eventually support vast forests. Picture this transformation happening over geological time. A single spore lands on bare granite. It germinates, grows, reproduces, and dies, leaving behind tiny particles of organic matter. Its offspring do the same, and their offspring after them. Over thousands, then millions of years, these accumulated generations create the first thin layer of soil. Other organisms begin to colonize this newly created habitat: bacteria, fungi, and tiny invertebrates. The soil deepens, becomes more complex, and more capable of supporting larger plants. This is the legacy of those first moss pioneers. Every forest you've ever walked through, every garden you've ever admired, every green space that brings you peace. It all began with organisms much like the mosses we can still find today, quietly going about their business of turning rock into life. Ferns came later in this story, but they brought their own revolutionary innovations. They developed vascular systems, internal highways for water and nutrients that allowed them to grow much larger than their moss cousins. They created the first true leaves, the first complex root systems, and the first tree-like growth forms. Roughly 360 million years ago, during an ancient age of lush forests and giant plants, tree ferns ruled the landscape. These weren't the small, delicate ferns we see in modern forests. These were giants, some reaching heights of 30 meters or more. They formed the world's first true forests, creating canopy ecosystems that had never existed before. The coal we burn today is largely the compressed remains of these ancient fern forests. Today, both mosses and ferns continue to thrive alongside the flowering plants that dominate most modern ecosystems. They've found their roles in the world, and they've maintained strategies that have proven successful for hundreds of millions of years. They're living links to our planet's deep past, carrying forward ancient wisdom about how to live successfully on land. To really understand mosses and ferns, we need to grasp one of the most fundamental concepts in plant biology, something called alternation of generations. This might sound complex, but it's actually a beautiful and elegant solution to the challenges of terrestrial reproduction. Most animals, including humans, have what we call a direct life cycle. We begin life as a fertilized cell, grow into an infant, develop into an adult, and eventually produce sperm or ova, the cells that unite to continue the cycle of life. Plants follow a more complex life cycle than animals, one that shifts between two distinct forms. One form is diploid, called the sporophyte, which produces spores through meiosis. These spores grow into the second form, a haploid stage that produces reproductive cells. When two of these cells come together, a new sporophyte is formed and the cycle begins again. Now, here's where it gets truly fascinating. In different groups of plants, these two generations take on very different roles and appearances. The balance of power, so to speak, shifts dramatically as we move through plant evolution. In mosses, the gametophyte is the dominant generation. It's the green, photosynthetic plant that we typically think of as the moss. It can live for years, even decades, slowly growing and spreading across its substrate. The sporophyte, on the other hand, is much smaller and simpler, often just a stalk with a capsule on top that remains attached to and dependent on the gametophyte throughout its entire existence. In ferns, this relationship is completely reversed. The sporophyte, the large leafy fern that we see in the forest, is dominant and can live for many years. The gametophyte is tiny, heart-shaped, and often overlooked entirely. It typically lives for just a few months, long enough to produce gametes and give rise to the next sporophyte generation. By the time we get to flowering plants, the gametophyte generation has become almost microscopic, reduced to just a few cells within pollen grains and ovules. This shift in generational dominance tells us a story about plant evolution and the changing strategies for success on land. As plants developed better vascular systems and structural support, the benefits of being large and diploid began to outweigh the benefits of the simpler haploid lifestyle. But there's something profound about this alternation of generations that goes beyond just evolutionary strategy. It represents a fundamentally different way of thinking about individual identity and the continuity of life. In our animal-centric view, we tend to think of an individual as a single, continuous entity from birth to death. But plants challenge this notion. Is a moss plant the gametophyte or the sporophyte? In a sense, it's both and neither. It's a continuous cycle of transformation, each generation giving rise to something completely different yet fundamentally connected. This concept reveals something profound about the nature of life itself. It shows us that existence can be more fluid, more transformative than we usually think. The moss doesn't simply make copies of itself. It becomes something completely different while still carrying forward its essential identity through each generation. When you look at a patch of moss, what you're seeing is actually thousands of individual gametophyte plants living together in a dense cooperative community. Each tiny shoot represents a single haploid organism, and together they create these beautiful carpets that can persist for decades or even centuries. Let's start with their anatomy. The main body consists of simple shoots with tiny leaves arranged in spirals around a central stem. These leaves are usually just one cell thick, an elegant solution to the challenge of gas exchange. With such thin leaves, every cell is in direct contact with the atmosphere, allowing for efficient absorption of carbon dioxide and release of oxygen. This single cell thickness is actually quite remarkable when you think about it. Most plant leaves have multiple layers of cells, each with its own job. From gathering sunlight to moving water and gases, they usually have an upper and lower surface, photosynthetic cells, air spaces for gas exchange, and veins to transport nutrients. Moss leaves manage to do all of that with just one layer of cells. The stems are equally simple but effective. Unlike the complex transport systems we'll see in ferns, moss stems rely on basic tissue for support and movement of water. Some mosses have early versions of transport cells that act a bit like the veins found in more advanced plants, but in a much simpler form. Water and nutrients move mainly through osmosis and capillary action, which limits how tall moss can grow, but also means they don't need complex internal plumbing. At the base of each moss, you'll find fine, root-like threads that anchor the plant and help it absorb moisture. These aren't true roots like those in larger plants, but they serve a similar role. They're incredibly thin, often just a single cell, and can reach deep into tiny cracks in rocks and soil. But here's something remarkable about mosses. They don't just absorb water through their root-like threads. The entire surface of the plant can absorb moisture directly from rain, fog, or even humid air. This is why moss thrives in environments that might seem too dry for other plants. They're incredibly efficient at capturing and conserving every bit of available moisture. Some mosses have developed specialized structures for water retention. Certain species have leaves with deep channels or grooves that help direct water toward the stem. Others have hair-like extensions on their leaves that increase surface area for water absorption. Still others can curl their leaves tightly when dry, protecting their photosynthetic machinery until moisture returns. This ability to absorb water from their entire surface makes mosses incredibly resilient to drought. When conditions become dry, many moss species can enter a state of cryptobiosis, essentially shutting down all metabolic activity and waiting for moisture to return. They can remain in this dormant state for months or even years, springing back to life within hours of being re-wetted. Now, let's follow the moss life cycle from the beginning. It starts with a spore, a single haploid cell released from the sporophyte of a parent plant. This spore is incredibly resilient, capable of surviving harsh conditions that would kill more complex organisms. The spore wall is thick and protective, often containing compounds that shield the genetic material from ultraviolet radiation and desiccation. When conditions are right, moisture and temperature suitable, the spore germinates and begins to grow into a structure called a protonema. This early growth looks like a green thread or a tiny bit of algae, and it's the very first stage in the moss life cycle. Known as the protonema, it spreads by cell division across the surface, starting the process of photosynthesis. This stage is fascinating because it holds a kind of living memory of moss's aquatic ancestry. These thread-like forms closely resemble the filamentous green algae from which land plants evolved. In a way, every moss spore briefly revisits that ancient transition when it begins to grow. From this thread-like structure, tiny buds form and eventually grow into the moss shoots we recognize. Each one has the potential to develop into a full plant. which is why entire colonies can spread so effectively from a single spore. As these plants mature, they form reproductive organs, often triggered by environmental changes like moisture, light, or temperature. Some develop antheridia, the male structures that produce sperm. These are typically small and club-shaped, found at the tips of shoots or nestled within special clusters of leaves. In some moss species, individual plants are either male or female, a condition called dioecious. In others, a single plant can produce both types of reproductive structures, which is called monoecious. The sperm produced in the antheridia are remarkably complex for such simple plants. They have two flagella whip-like structures that allow them to swim through water. They also contain mitochondria to provide energy for their journey and a nucleus containing the genetic material that will combine with the egg. Here's where we see the moss's continued dependence on water for reproduction. The sperm must literally swim from the antheridia to the archegonia, and this can only happen when there's a thin film of water covering the plant. This might seem like a limitation, but it's actually allowed mosses to thrive in environments where this condition is regularly met, from tropical rainforests to temperate woodlands to Arctic tundra. The swimming distance might seem trivial to us, but from the sperm's perspective, it's an epic journey. They might need to swim several centimeters, navigating around obstacles, following chemical gradients released by the archegonia. Many don't make it, but evolution has ensured that enough do to maintain the species. When a sperm successfully reaches an egg, fertilization occurs and something magical happens. The resulting zygote begins to develop right there within the archegonium, but it's no longer haploid like its gametophyte parent. It's diploid, the beginning of the sporophyte generation. This transition from gametophyte to sporophyte represents one of the most fundamental transformations in biology. It's not just a change in chromosome number, it's a complete reorganization of cellular priorities and developmental programs. The sporophyte will have different nutritional requirements, different growth patterns, and ultimately a completely different life purpose than the stage that gave rise to it. The moss sporophyte has one primary job: to produce and disperse spores that will give rise to the next gametophyte generation. But the way it accomplishes this task is a masterpiece of biological engineering that has been refined over hundreds of millions of years. The sporophyte develops as a slender stalk topped with a capsule, and it remains physically connected to and nutritionally dependent on the gametophyte throughout its life. This is a beautiful example of biological cooperation, two different generations working together, each contributing what it does best. The gametophyte provides the sporophyte with water, nutrients, and a stable foundation. It's already established in a suitable location, with its fine, root-like threads anchored in the substrate and its leaves positioned to capture sunlight. The sporophyte, in turn, focuses all of its energy on the complex process of spore production and dispersal. Inside the capsule of the sporophyte, specialized cells undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. But this isn't just a random process. The timing, the number of spores produced, and the mechanism of their release are all carefully coordinated with environmental conditions. The development of spores within the capsule is a precisely orchestrated process. First, diploid sporogenous tissue develops within the capsule. These cells then undergo meiosis, the special type of cell division that reduces chromosome number from diploid to haploid. But meiosis in plants is more than just chromosome reduction, it's also the stage where genetic recombination occurs, shuffling genes between chromosomes to create new combinations. This genetic shuffling is crucial for plant evolution and adaptation. Each spore produced carries a unique combination of genes, potentially giving it advantages in different environments or conditions. Some spores might be better adapted to drought, others to low light, or others to different soil conditions. This genetic diversity is one of the keys to the success of mosses in such a wide range of habitats. Most moss capsules have a beautiful mechanism for spore release. The top of the capsule, called the operculum, acts like a lid that pops off when the spores are mature. The timing of this release is often coordinated with favorable weather conditions for spore dispersal. Underneath the operculum, there's often a ring of teeth-like structures called the peristome that respond to humidity changes. These teeth are hygroscopic, meaning they absorb moisture from the air and change shape as humidity levels change. When the air is humid, the teeth curl inward, keeping the spores protected inside the capsule. When the air is dry and suitable for spore dispersal, the teeth straighten and spread apart, opening pathways for spore release. This hygroscopic mechanism is so precise that it can respond to daily changes in humidity. Opening during the dry conditions of midday when air currents are strong, and closing during the humid conditions of evening and early morning when spore dispersal would be less effective. The spores themselves are incredibly small and light, designed to be carried by even gentle air currents. They're typically 10 to 100 micrometers in diameter, small enough to remain airborne for extended periods. A single moss plant can produce millions of spores over its lifetime, each one a potential founder of a new colony. The spore wall is a marvel of biological engineering. It must be strong enough to protect the genetic material during potentially long periods of dispersal, yet permeable enough to allow gas exchange and water absorption when germination conditions are met. Many spores have elaborate surface patterns, ridges, spines, or other structures that may help with dispersal or protection. This strategy of producing vast numbers of tiny dispersible spores has been incredibly successful for mosses. They've colonized virtually every terrestrial habitat on Earth, from tropical rainforests to polar regions, from desert rocks to urban sidewalks. You can find mosses growing on every continent, including Antarctica, and at elevations from sea level to high mountain peaks. The ability to produce and disperse spores efficiently has also allowed mosses to be among the first colonizers of disturbed habitats. After volcanic eruptions, landslides, fires, or other disturbances that remove existing vegetation, moss spores are often among the first to arrive and begin the process of ecological succession. Now, let's shift our attention to the ferns and discover how they revolutionize plant life with a completely different approach to terrestrial living. If mosses represent the perfection of staying small and simple, ferns represent the triumph of growing large and complex. The key innovation that allowed ferns to grow much larger than mosses was the development of vascular tissue. These are specialized cells that form internal highways for transporting water, nutrients, and sugars throughout the plant. This vascular system includes xylem, which carries water and minerals from the roots to the leaves, and phloem, which transports sugars produced by photosynthesis to wherever they're needed. The evolution of vascular tissue was one of the most important innovations in plant history. It freed plants from the constraint of having every cell close to a water source and allowed them to grow tall, to compete for sunlight, and to colonize a much wider range of habitats. Xylem tissue consists of specialized cells that are actually dead at maturity. These cells have thick, lignified walls that provide structural support, and they're connected end to end to form continuous tubes that can transport water from roots to leaves. The movement of water through xylem is driven primarily by transpiration, the evaporation of water from leaf surfaces, which creates a negative pressure that pulls water up from the roots. Phloem tissue, on the other hand, consists of living cells that are highly specialized for transport. Sugar molecules produced by photosynthesis in the leaves are loaded into phloem cells and transported to other parts of the plant where they're needed for growth, metabolism, or storage. With this vascular system, ferns could grow tall without every cell needing to be close to a water source. They could develop true roots that penetrate deep into the soil and true leaves that could be large and complex without worrying about gas exchange in their inner cells. This vascular innovation opened up entirely new ways of living. Some ferns became climbers, using other plants for support while reaching toward the light. Others became aquatic, taking advantage of their vascular systems to transport gases between submerged and aerial parts. Still others became tree-like, creating the first forest canopies in Earth's history. The diversity of fern forms is truly remarkable. There are tiny ferns that grow as epiphytes on tree bark, their entire adult size smaller than a single leaf of their giant relatives. There are aquatic ferns that float on the surface of ponds and lakes. There are desert ferns that can survive months without water, curling their fronds tightly and entering dormancy until rain returns. Some of the most spectacular ferns are the tree ferns of tropical and subtropical regions. These living monuments can grow over 20 meters tall. Their trunks aren't made of wood like flowering trees, but of tightly packed roots and leaf bases that grow from the stem. At the top, they open massive fronds that can stretch several meters long, forming a canopy that supports countless other species. Let's examine a typical fern frond, what we commonly call a fern leaf. The frond consists of a stalk called a stipe and a blade called a lamina. The lamina is often highly divided into smaller leaflets called penni, and these may be further divided into pinnules. This complex architecture maximizes surface area for photosynthesis while maintaining structural strength. The degree of frond division varies enormously among fern species and often reflects their ecological adaptations. Ferns in bright, open habitats often have highly divided fronds that help dissipate excess light energy and reduce water loss. Ferns in deep shade typically have broader, less divided fronds that maximize light capture in low light conditions. Unlike moss leaves, fern fronds are many cells thick and have a sophisticated internal structure. The upper surface is covered with a waxy cuticle that helps prevent water loss, while the lower surface contains numerous stomata, microscopic pores that can open and close to regulate gas exchange and water loss. Many ferns also develop specialized underground stems called rhizomes. These can serve multiple functions. They allow the plant to spread vegetatively, creating new shoots at intervals along the rhizome. They provide storage for carbohydrates and other nutrients, and they can help the plant survive adverse conditions by maintaining growing points below ground. One of the most recognizable features of ferns is the way their young fronds unfurl. These tightly coiled structures, called fiddleheads, protect the delicate growing tip as it pushes through soil and debris. The unfurling process, called cercinate vernation, is both protective and efficient, allowing the frond to expand rapidly once it reaches favorable conditions. The fiddlehead stage is actually quite vulnerable, and many ferns have evolved additional protective mechanisms. Some species cover their developing fronds with scales or hairs that provide protection from herbivores and dehydration. Others produce chemical compounds that make the young fronds unpalatable to potential predators. In ferns, we see a complete reversal of the generational balance we observed in mosses. Here, the sporophyte, the large, leafy fern plant, is dominant, while the gametophyte is reduced to a tiny, often overlooked structure. This shift in dominance reflects the evolutionary advantages of the diploid condition for large, complex organisms. Diploid organisms have 2 copies of each gene, which provides a buffer against harmful mutations and allows for more complex gene regulation. For large, long-lived plants like ferns, these advantages outweigh the metabolic costs of maintaining twice as much genetic material. The adult fern makes spores in tiny clusters on the underside of its leaves. These clusters often look like brown or rusty spots. Each one is filled with even smaller capsules that create the spores. The location and arrangement of sori are often species specific and can be used to identify different fern species. In some, they appear in neat rows along the veins of the fronds. In others, they may be scattered across the surface or grouped in noticeable shapes, like circles, lines, or even covering the entire underside of certain fertile leaves. Many ferns protect their developing sori with a thin membrane called an indusium. This structure covers the young sporangia, protecting them from dehydration and herbivory while they mature. As the sporangia ripen, the indusium often shrinks or falls away, exposing the mature spore-bearing structures. The sporangia have their own elegant mechanism for spore release that represents one of the most sophisticated catapult systems in the natural world. As the sporangium matures and dries out, tension builds up in a specialized row of cells called the annulus. This ring of cells has thickened walls on one side, and as it loses water, it begins to curl backward. The tension continues to build until the sporangium suddenly snaps open with explosive force, catapulting spores into the air. High-speed photography has revealed that this mechanism can launch spores at accelerations of up to 100,000 times the force of gravity, achieving initial velocities of several meters per second. This mechanism can launch spores several centimeters away from the parent plant. Quite a distance when you consider the microscopic size of the structures involved. The timing of spore release is often coordinated with environmental conditions, typically occurring during dry periods when air currents are most likely to carry the spores to new locations. When a fern spore lands in a suitable location and conditions are right for germination, it develops into the gametophyte generation, a small heart-shaped structure called a prothallus. The prothallus is typically less than a centimeter across and is often overlooked entirely, but it plays a crucial role in the fern life cycle. The prothallus is a fascinating structure that represents a free-living gametophyte generation of ferns. Unlike the moss gametophyte, which can live for years and forms the dominant phase of the life cycle, the fern prothallus is short-lived and inconspicuous, yet it's remarkably sophisticated in its own way. The prothallus is typically flat and green, capable of photosynthesis and independent survival. It's anchored to the substrate by tiny rhizoids, similar to those of mosses, but much simpler in structure. The entire structure is usually just one cell thick, except for a central cushion where the reproductive organs develop. The prothallus produces both male and female reproductive structures, but not necessarily at the same time. The antheridia, which produce sperm, are typically located on the thicker central portion of the prothallus. They're small dome-shaped structures that contain numerous sperm cells. The archegonia, which contain the eggs, are usually found near the notch at the heart-shaped tip of the prothallus. They're flask-shaped structures with long necks that extend slightly above the surface of the prothallus. Like mosses, ferns still require water for reproduction. The sperm must swim from the antheridia to the archegonia, and this can only happen when the prothallus is covered with a thin film of water. This continued dependence on water for reproduction is why ferns are most diverse and abundant in moist environments, despite their sophisticated vascular systems. The fern sperm are remarkably similar to those of mosses, with multiple flagella that allow them to swim through water. They're also chemically attracted to the archegonia, following gradients of chemical signals released by the female reproductive organs. When fertilization occurs, the resulting diploid zygote begins developing into a new sporophyte while still attached to the prothallus. Unlike in mosses, however, the young fern sporophyte quickly becomes independent. It develops its own roots and leaves, and once it's established, the tiny gametophyte withers away, having completed its role in the life cycle. The transition from gametophyte to sporophyte in ferns is more dramatic than in mosses. The young sporophyte must quickly establish its own photosynthetic capacity and root system, transitioning from dependence on the prothallus to complete independence. This vulnerable stage is often where mortality is highest in the fern life cycle. Both mosses and ferns play crucial ecological roles in modern ecosystems, roles that extend far beyond their individual survival strategies. They're ecosystem engineers, habitat creators, and essential components of nutrient cycles that support the broader web of life. Mosses are incredibly important for water retention in forest ecosystems. A moss-covered forest floor can hold many times its weight in water, slowly releasing it during dry periods and helping to moderate the moisture levels that other plants depend on. This water retention capacity is particularly important in forest ecosystems where seasonal drought is common. The water holding capacity of moss colonies is truly remarkable. Some species can absorb and hold up to 20 times their dry weight in water. This water is then available to other plants, soil microorganisms, and the countless small animals that live within moss colonies. During dry periods, this stored water can mean the difference between survival and death for many forest organisms. Mosses also help prevent soil erosion, binding loose particles together with their rhizoids and creating stable surfaces on slopes and disturbed areas. Their ability to colonize bare soil and rock makes them crucial pioneer species in ecological succession. After disturbances like landslides, fires, or human activities, mosses are often among the first organisms to establish, beginning the slow process of soil building and ecosystem recovery. The role of mosses in carbon cycling is also significant. Although individual moss plants are small, moss communities can cover vast areas and represent substantial carbon storage. Peat moss, in particular, is responsible for storing enormous amounts of carbon in peat bogs, helping to regulate global carbon cycles and climate. These moss carpets support entire communities of microscopic life. Tardigrades, those nearly indestructible water bears, rotifers, nematodes, and countless bacteria and fungi make their homes in the moist spaces between moss leaves. For many of these organisms, moss colonies represent entire worlds, complete ecosystems in miniature. The biodiversity within moss colonies is often overlooked, but can be extraordinarily high. A single handful of moss might contain thousands of individual microorganisms representing dozens of species. These communities are complex food webs in their own right, with predators and prey, decomposers, and primary producers all existing within the protective environment created by the moss. Ferns contribute to forest ecosystems in different but equally important ways. Their large fronds create distinctive microclimates in forest understories, providing shelter and hunting grounds for countless insects, spiders, and other small animals. The space beneath a large fern frond can be several degrees cooler and significantly more humid than the surrounding environment, creating shelter for moisture-sensitive species. Many bird species rely on ferns for nesting materials, and some specialize in feeding on the insects that live among fern fronds. In tropical forests, the diversity of insects associated with ferns can be remarkable, with many species found nowhere else. Ferns also provide direct resources for larger animals. The young fiddleheads of many species are edible and nutritious, supporting everything from insects to large mammals. Some cultures have traditionally harvested fiddleheads as a seasonal food source, though care must be taken as some species can be toxic. The bracken fern, one of the most widespread fern species in the world, provides an interesting example of both the benefits and challenges of fern ecology. While it provides habitat for many species and helps prevent soil erosion, it can also become invasive in disturbed areas, forming dense stands that exclude other plants. Both mosses and ferns are important pioneer species, among the first plants to colonize disturbed or degraded habitats. After events like landslides, volcanic eruptions, or human disturbances, these plants often lead the process of ecological succession, gradually creating conditions that allow other species to establish. Their role as pioneers is particularly important in our current era of rapid environmental change. As climate change and human activities continue to create new disturbances, the ability of mosses and ferns to quickly colonize and stabilize these areas becomes increasingly valuable. In urban environments, mosses and ferns demonstrate remarkable adaptability. Mosses grow on concrete sidewalks, building walls, and rooftops, helping to soften the harsh edges of human built environments. They can colonize the smallest cracks and crevices, bringing life to otherwise sterile surfaces. Urban mosses also provide important ecosystem services, helping to filter air pollutants, moderate local temperatures, and provide habitat for urban wildlife. Some cities are beginning to recognize the value of urban mosses and are incorporating them into green infrastructure projects. Ferns find homes in urban parks, abandoned lots, and even the cracks between buildings, bringing a touch of ancient green to modern landscapes. Many fern species are remarkably tolerant of air pollution and can thrive in urban environments where other plants struggle. The study of mosses and ferns in urban environments is revealing new insights about plant adaptation and urban ecology. Some urban moss populations show genetic differences from their non-urban counterparts, suggesting rapid evolutionary responses to urban conditions. As we face a time of rapid environmental change, the conservation of mosses and ferns presents both challenges and opportunities. Many species are threatened by habitat loss, climate change, and human activities, while others are proving remarkably adaptable to changing conditions. Moss and fern conservation faces unique challenges because these plants are often overlooked in favor of more charismatic flora and fauna. Many species have very specific habitat requirements and limited dispersal abilities, making them vulnerable to environmental changes. Climate change poses particular challenges for these ancient survivors. Many moss and fern species are adapted to very specific moisture and temperature conditions. As climate patterns shift, some species may find their suitable habitat moving faster than they can disperse to new areas. However, the same characteristics that have allowed mosses and ferns to survive for hundreds of millions of years may also help them adapt to future changes. Their ability to rapidly colonize new habitats, their diverse reproductive strategies, and their tolerance for harsh conditions may prove valuable in a changing world. Some moss species are already showing responses to climate change. In Arctic regions, changing temperature and precipitation patterns are altering moss communities, with some species expanding their ranges while others retreat. These changes have cascading effects on entire ecosystems, as mosses form the foundation of many Arctic food webs. Ferns face similar challenges, but their greater dispersal abilities may give them some advantages. Many fern species produce vast numbers of wind-dispersed spores, potentially allowing them to track suitable habitat as climate zones shift. Research into moss and fern biology is also revealing new potential applications for human benefit. The remarkable dehydration tolerance of many moss species is being studied for insights into crop improvement and biotechnology. Some moss compounds show promise as natural antibiotics or other pharmaceuticals. The ability of mosses to absorb and concentrate heavy metals and other pollutants is being investigated for environmental remediation applications. Moss biomonitoring programs use these plants as living sensors of air quality and environmental contamination. As we come to the end of our journey tonight, let's take a moment to appreciate what mosses and ferns have taught us about life on Earth. These plants have been conducting experiments in terrestrial living for hundreds of millions of years, and their strategies have proven remarkably successful. Mosses show us the power of staying close to our essential needs, of building communities that support each individual member, and of finding ways to thrive in conditions that others might find challenging. They remind us that bigger isn't always better, and that some of the most successful strategies are also the most gentle ones. The moss approach to life is fundamentally collaborative. Individual moss plants are small and seemingly vulnerable, but together they create resilient communities that can persist for centuries. They share resources, create favorable microclimates for each other, and collectively engineer their environment to support the entire community. This collaborative approach extends beyond individual moss species. Moss communities often support diverse groups of other organisms, creating habitat and resources for countless microorganisms, small invertebrates, and other plants. The moss doesn't just survive, it creates conditions that allow entire ecosystems to flourish. There's something profoundly calming about the moss way of life. These plants don't rush, don't compete aggressively, don't try to dominate their environment. Instead, they persist quietly, growing slowly but steadily, adapting to conditions rather than trying to control them. In our fast-paced, competitive world, there's wisdom in this gentle persistence. Ferns demonstrate the importance of developing strong foundations, those vascular systems that allow them to reach new heights while staying grounded. They show us how innovation can open up entirely new ways of living, and how sometimes taking a completely different approach can lead to extraordinary success. The fern strategy is one of calculated investment in infrastructure. By developing complex vascular systems, true roots, and sophisticated leaves, ferns were able to access resources and opportunities that were unavailable to simpler plants. This investment in complexity paid off, allowing ferns to grow larger, live longer, and colonize a wider range of habitats. But ferns also show us that innovation doesn't mean abandoning all connections to the past. Despite their sophisticated sporophyte generation, ferns maintain their ancestral dependence on water for reproduction. They've found ways to honor their evolutionary heritage while adapting to new opportunities. The alternation of generations that both mosses and ferns exhibit offer its own philosophical insights. These plants embody the principle that identity can be fluid, that an organism can be fundamentally different at different stages of its life while maintaining essential continuity. The moss gametophyte and sporophyte are as different as two organisms can be, while still being the same species. This concept challenges our animal-centric notions of individual identity and suggests that life itself might be more about processes and relationships than about fixed forms. The moss or fern is not just the plant we see, but the entire cycle of transformation from spore to gametophyte to sporophyte and back to spore. Together, these ancient survivors remind us that diversity of strategies leads to ecosystem resilience. The forest floor that supports both the tiny moss gametophyte and the towering fern sporophytes demonstrates the extraordinary stability, beauty, and resilience that comes from diversity. In a world facing unprecedented environmental challenges, the success strategies of mosses and ferns offer valuable lessons. Their ability to persist through dramatic climate changes, their role as ecosystem engineers, and their capacity for both cooperation and adaptation provide models for resilience that we desperately need. The study of these plants also reminds us of the importance of paying attention to the overlooked and underappreciated. Mosses and ferns are rarely the stars of nature documentaries or conservation campaigns, yet they play crucial roles in maintaining the health and stability of ecosystems worldwide. As we continue to explore and understand the natural world, it's important to remember that some of the most valuable insights come from the quietest corners. From the organisms that persist without fanfare, that succeed through patience rather than aggression, that build communities rather than compete for dominance. Next time you're walking through a forest, or even just past a patch of moss growing on an urban sidewalk, pause for a moment and take a closer look at them. Notice the intricate structure of a fern frond, the way morning dew collects in moss colonies, the quiet persistence of plants that have been perfecting their craft since before the first trees ever existed. Look closely at the moss carpet beneath your feet and imagine the thousands of individual plants working together to create that soft green foundation. Think about the countless generations that lived and died to build the soil that supports the entire forest ecosystem. When you see a fern unfurling its fiddlehead, remember that you're witnessing a process that has been refined over hundreds of millions of years, an elegant solution to the challenge of protecting delicate growing tissues while maximizing growth efficiency. These plants connect us to deep time and the ancient history of life on our planet. They're living links to a world that existed long before humans, mammals, or flowers. Yet they remain thoroughly modern, continuing to evolve and adapt while finding new ways to thrive in our changing world. In their quiet persistence and collaborative approach to survival, mosses and ferns offer us a different model for success. Rather than the aggressive competition that often dominates human thinking, they demonstrate a model based on patience, cooperation, and deep adaptation to local conditions. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, perhaps we have something to learn from these ancient survivors. Perhaps success isn't always about growing faster, competing harder, or dominating our environment. Sometimes it's about finding our space and building supportive communities while persisting with quiet determination through whatever changes come our way. Thank you for joining me in the Quiet Lab tonight. If this gentle exploration of moss and fern biology resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe for more peaceful journeys through the biological world. And don't forget to share your own observations about the mosses and ferns in your life, whether you've encountered them on forest hikes, in urban spaces, or anywhere in between. Thanks again for exploring these amazing plants with me tonight. I hope you'll notice them a little differently next time you're out in the world. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next video.